At a farm auction outside a small town in central Nebraska, a 71-year-old man named Walt Dobbins raised his hand and paid $250 for a dead, rusted-out school bus the auctioneer had already tried 3 times to give away for free. People laughed, not quietly. A couple of them clapped. To the men leaning on the fence rail, it was the best show in weeks. Old Walt Dobbins, who used to own the tidy house on 3rd Street, putting real money on a gutted yellow bus sitting on 4 flat tires because it was the only thing left in the world he could afford to call his own. Nobody was laughing 4 months later. What Walt built inside that bus, with his own hands, in the cold, on almost no money, turned the joke of the county into something those same people would drive out of their way just to stand and look at. But first, on the coldest week of the winter, they nearly hauled the whole thing off to the scrapyard with everything he owned inside it, and Walt nearly lost it all a second time. Hold on to that. We will get there. Because to understand why a proud old man put real money on a rolling wreck while his neighbors laughed, you first have to understand what he had already lost. And what he did with that wreck is something almost nobody knows how to do anymore. Walt Dobbins was not a helpless man. That was the part that made the laughter sting, and the part that should have warned them. He had spent his war as an Army combat engineer, which is a job most people have never heard of, and every soldier who has been near one respects. Combat engineers are the men who build the bridge across the river while the river is being shot at. They clear the road. They raise the shelter. They make something stand up out of nothing, fast, under pressure, with whatever is on the truck. Walt did that for 2 years in a place that did not forgive mistakes. He came home in 1973 with a set of skills the civilian world quietly runs on and never quite pays for. For 40 years, none of it looked like survival. It looked like a life. He ran a small construction and handyman outfit out of a garage on the edge of town. He built decks and porches and pole barns and re-poured half the foundations in the county at one time or another. He married a woman named Marion. They raised 2 kids in that house on 3rd Street, the one with the porch he had rebuilt with his own hands. He was the man you called when a thing needed fixing right. He was respected. He was, by every measure that town used, fine. The unraveling did not come from anything he did wrong. That is the part people never want to hear, because it is easier to believe that a man who ends up with nothing must have earned it. Marion got sick in her late 60s. The kind of sick that comes with a hospital bill that does not care how many decks you built. The insurance covered some of it, and then found the ways insurance finds not to cover the rest. Walt did what men of his generation do. He did not complain. He signed things. He took the offer from the company that promised to let him stay in his home and pull a little money out of it to cover the bills, and he did not read all 40 pages the way a tired, grieving man rarely does. When Marion passed, the arithmetic came due. The balance on the house had quietly grown while he was not looking. The property taxes on a place he had owned outright for 30 years came at him like a second grief. And within about 2 years of the funeral, the house on 3rd Street, the porch, the workshop, all of it belonged to somebody else. Walt Dobbins was 70 years old, a skilled builder, a veteran, and functionally homeless in the same town where he had built half of everything. He kept one thing from the house. Not a tool, not a keepsake of his own. A photograph of Marion on the porch he had built her, the summer their youngest was born. He slid it into the visor of the truck. And on the night he handed over the keys and drove away from 3rd Street for the last time, he did not look in the rearview mirror. A man who has carried friends off a battlefield learns young that you do not turn around to watch the thing you cannot carry with you. He drove to the edge of town, parked where the streetlights ran out, and started doing the only thing he had ever really known how to do when everything was gone. He took inventory of what he had left. He moved into that truck and a rented storage unit. He was too proud to knock on his own children's doors, both of them 2 states away and stretched thin themselves, and far too proud to let the town see him ask for anything. And the town, the way towns do, mostly just watched and talked and formed its quiet opinion that Walt Dobbins had let himself go. So when the notice went up for a farm dispersal auction out past the county line, and one of the last sad lots on the list was a gutted 1980s school bus, engine seized, seats long gone, floor rusting through, sitting dead on a patch of gravel nobody wanted either, most people saw junk. Walt Dobbins saw the one thing on that whole property he could actually afford, and something none of the laughing men on the fence rail thought to consider. He saw a steel shell that was already built to be lived in, already road legal in its bones, and, unlike a house or a shack or a hole in the ground, a home that a man could someday drive away. He bid $250. The laughter that followed him out of that auction yard is the laughter this whole story is about. If you have ever been counted out by people who should have known better, stay with this. Subscribe if a story like this is worth 10 minutes of your week. Here is what the men on the fence rail did not understand, because they had never had to know it. A school bus is not junk. It is a steel box on a heavy frame, engineered from the factory to carry weight and take a beating. And that is a tremendous head start for a man who knows how to finish it. It is long and narrow, which is efficient to heat. It sits up off the cold ground on its own frame, which a shack never does. And it has the one thing every other cheap shelter on Earth lacks: it can move. Walt did not see a dead bus. He saw a shell that had already done half the hard work for free if a man understood where its strength lived and where it had rotted. But knowing and doing are separated by a Nebraska winter, and he was starting in the fall with almost nothing. The first thing he did was the thing his whole career had taught him. He did not start building. He started assessing. A combat engineer does not fall in love with a structure. He interrogates it. He spent days going over that bus inch by inch, and he learned the hard way, early, exactly where its weakness was. He was stepping down the aisle to check the far windows when the floor gave a soft, sickening flex under his boot. A section of subfloor rusted paper-thin under the old rubber matting, ready to drop a man straight through onto the frozen ground below. He froze, shifted his weight back onto the solid rib, and stood there a long moment with his heart going. That was the lesson. The whole floor had to come out and be rebuilt before he trusted a single other thing to it, because everything he was about to build would stand on that floor, and a home is only ever as sound as the thing under your feet. So he started at the bottom, the way you have to. He tore out the rotten subfloor down to the steel ribs, treated the rust he could save and cut out what he couldn't, and laid a new floor on a bed of framing and insulation, sealed against the damp coming up from underneath. Only then, with something solid to stand on, did he begin to build up. The steel shell was the next enemy, and it is the one almost everybody underestimates. Bare metal in a Nebraska January is a wall of ice. Touch the inside skin of that bus at 20 below, and it will pull the warmth straight out of your hand. So before Walt thought about heat, he thought about stopping the cold from coming in and the warmth from leaking out, because that, not the stove, is the whole game. He built a timber frame standing off the metal, and he packed the gap with every scrap of insulation he could scavenge and afford. He cut the number of windows down to a few, because glass is a hole in your wall that cold pours through, and the ones he kept he sealed and framed tight. He ran a proper vapor barrier so the warm inside air could not sweat against the cold steel and soak the insulation. A mistake that has quietly ruined more homemade shelters than the cold ever has. Then, because he was Walt Dobbins and he could not help himself, he finished the inside not just to survive, but to be beautiful. He lined the walls and the low curved ceiling with reclaimed barn wood he pulled from a collapsing shed for the cost of hauling it. He built a raised bed across the back over deep storage drawers, a little galley along one side, and shelves fitted into every foot of that narrow space the way a ship is built, where nothing is wasted. He set a small wood stove on a proper stone hearth with a steel heat shield behind it, and the clearances a lifetime of building had taught him to respect, because a fire inside a metal box is a thing you treat with the seriousness it deserves. He ran the flue up straight and clean through a sealed, flashed collar in the roof so it drew right and stayed safe, and he packed stone around the stove so the heat would soak into the mass and give it back for hours after the fire died down. Piece by piece, on almost no money, a gutted joke of a school bus became a warm, dry, solid, genuinely handsome little home. And almost nobody knew, because Walt kept his head down and his mouth shut and let them think whatever they wanted. They watched him do it, though. That was the part that would have broken a smaller man. The county road ran close enough that people slowed their trucks just to look, and some of them did not bother to hide the grin. "There goes Walt," they said, playing house in a school bus. For weeks, he was the story at the diner counter, the punchline that needed no setup. He heard about it the way you always hear about it in a small town. secondhand, sideways, from the one or two people kind enough to be uncomfortable telling him. Walt said nothing. He had been shot at by men who genuinely wanted him dead. The opinion of people who had never built anything harder than a conversation did not move him an inch. He got up every cold morning and went back to work on his $250 wreck, and he let the winter, which was coming for all of them equally, be the one to make his argument. Then, on the coldest week of the winter, the county truck came. Someone had filed a complaint. Walt never knew for certain who, though he had his guess, and the guess wore the same face as one of the men who had laughed loudest at the auction. The complaint said what complaints like that always say, that an abandoned vehicle was being lived in illegally, that it was an eyesore and a hazard, and that it should be tagged, towed, and hauled to the scrapyard. And a few days before Christmas, with the temperature falling and the wind coming hard across the open ground, an official from the county pulled up that gravel drive with a clipboard and a tow company's number in his phone. Walt saw the county seal on the truck door from 100 yards off, and he felt a cold drop in his stomach he had not felt since the war. The feeling of a thing about to be taken that you cannot stop with your hands. He was 71. It was 4 days before Christmas. And a bus, unlike a house, is the one kind of home a man can lose in an afternoon, because a bus can be hooked to a chain and dragged away with everything inside it. Everything he had rebuilt, the whole quiet answer to all that laughter, could be sitting in a scrapyard by the weekend. This was the moment it was all supposed to end. A homeless old man, an illegal shack on wheels, a cold clipboard, and a winter with no mercy in it. This is the part of the story where men like Walt lose. Except Walt Dobbins had thought about this the way a combat engineer thinks about everything, which is to say 3 moves ahead. He had not bought an abandoned vehicle and let it rot into a structure. He had kept it a vehicle. He had put the title in his own name the day of the auction. He had gotten the engine turning over and the tags current, because he understood a truth those men with the clipboards forget, that a titled, registered, running vehicle is a man's personal property with rights, not an illegal building they can simply condemn. He walked that official around the whole of it, quietly, the way he did everything. The current registration. The engine that started on the second try in the cold and idled steady. The stove installed to code. The clearances measured to the inch. The structure sounder than half the legal houses in the county. He did not argue, and he did not beg. He just showed a man who came expecting a hazard exactly how wrong the complaint had been. The official stood in the snow for a long time. By many accounts, the people who come to haul away a desperate man's home do not often find themselves standing inside something built better than their own house, being quietly educated by a 71-year-old veteran on property law and fire clearances. Whatever was written on the clipboard when he arrived, what he wrote when he left was that it was a registered vehicle, lawfully owned, and none of the county's business to tow. It stayed. And the man who had filed the complaint had, without meaning to, handed Walt Dobbins the one thing the laughter never could, which was proof, on county paper, that the joke of the auction yard had been wrong about him all along. The winter that came after settled the rest of it without a word from Walt. I want to be honest about what a hard winter does out there, because it is the part that turns a story into a reckoning. When a deep freeze sits on the plains and the wind does not stop and the power grid gives out, the homes that fail first are not the poor ones. They are the ones that depend entirely on the grid, an electric furnace, and nothing behind it. When the power goes at 20 below, those houses have hours. And the people most at risk inside them, in that town like every town, are the old ones living alone, the proud ones who will not call for help, the ones who tell themselves it will come back on before it gets bad. In winters like that, across this country, people die that way every single year, quietly, at home. And most of us never hear a word about it. The night the grid went down across that county, the man they had laughed at was sitting inside a warm, glowing box of reclaimed barnwood at 68 degrees, feeding a stove that had never once needed the power company's permission. And when word got around, as it does, that old Walt Dobbins out past the county line still had heat. It was some of the same families who had laughed at the auction who ended up knocking on his door in the dark, looking for a warm place for their kids to sit out the blackout. And when they climbed the steps into that old school bus out of the screaming dark, they went quiet. Because the inside of Walt Dobbins's $250 wreck was not a shack. It was warm, honey-colored barnwood running the length of it, glowing in the lamplight. It was a stone hearth with a fire breathing low and steady, heat soaked so deep into the rock that the whole narrow room held it like a held breath. It was a bed built neat across the back and a little galley where a coffee pot was already going. It was, by any honest measure, more of a home than a lot of the houses those families had just left cold and dark behind them. The men who had laughed at a pile of yellow scrap were standing inside something built with more care than their own front rooms, and not one of them knew what to say. He let them in. Of course he let them in. He put the coffee on and pulled the chairs around the stove and did not say a single word about the auction, because a certain kind of man does not need to. The silence in that warm bus, with the wind screaming outside and the people who once laughed at him, now grateful just to be there, said everything a lifetime of pride would never let him say out loud. So why does this keep happening? Why does a skilled, decent, hardworking veteran end up bidding on a rusted-out bus in the same town he helped build? The easy answer is bad luck, and there is some of that. But the harder answer is the one worth sitting with. It is medical bills that can empty a lifetime of savings in a season. It is the quiet, predatory paperwork that finds tired, grieving old people and takes the house out from under them one clause at a time. It is a town that finds it easier to laugh at a man than to ask what happened to him. And it is pride, the same pride that built the man, becoming the wall that keeps him from ever asking for help. By many accounts, tens of thousands of American veterans face homelessness on any given night, and a great many of them are older men who once, by every measure, had it made. Walt Dobbins is still out there. The barn wood has darkened and warmed with the years. There is a chair by the stove and a light over the bed, and a thin thread of smoke that rises out of the trees on cold mornings. People do drive out to see it now. Some of them are the ones who laughed. Here is what I keep coming back to. They paid nothing to laugh at him. He paid $250 to prove them wrong, and then he was too dignified to ever mention it again. And here is the part they never understood, the part he built in on purpose. His home has wheels. The people who tried to pin him down and take everything, who laughed and complained and sent the county after him, handed a combat engineer the one home on earth they could never truly corner, because on any morning he chooses, Walt Dobbins can turn the key and simply be gone. If you have ever been written off by people who should have known better, tell me in the comments what they said and what you built anyway. Not for pity. Because someone is watching this tonight who is being counted out right now, and they need to see how this can go. Next time, I will tell you about a homeless Marine in her 60s who turned a $200 storage unit into a hidden home with heat and running water, in the middle of a city that spent years trying to find her and never could. Because some of the men and women this country trained to build and to survive were left, in the end, to prove it completely alone, in front of everyone, while the people around them laughed. And a few of them built something so quietly, stubbornly right, that the laughter had nowhere left to go but silent.